Brian Shaw is one of the biggest and strongest athletes in the history of time. He has won multiple World's Strongest Man competitions, has multiple records in various events, and has insanely strong hands. Brian's accomplishments in the world of grip strength alone are just ridiculous, and recently Brian has become interested in arm wrestling. Around 5 months ago, Derek Smith came to Brian's gym and taught him the basics of arm wrestling technique. Brian had arm wrestled before this, but I don't believe he had a technique-only training session like we saw with him and Derek, or at least not with someone who was nearly as big as Brian and therefore can relate ideas to him, as he knows what it feels like to be a giant on a table built for normal-sized humans. We see that of course Brian looked very robotic, but he is also looking very strong. Derek did seem to be very impressed with Brian and had some confidence that Brian really could be a legit arm wrestler if he fully committed to the sport. But can Brian ever reach the level of someone like Levan? It's one thing to be good, but it's a whole other thing to be number one in the world. This video will cover Brian Shaw's chances of becoming an elite arm wrestler and perhaps defeating Levan Saginishvili, and what would need to happen for that to be possible. Firstly, let's take a look at Brian's best potential style. Although Brian has not trained for arm wrestling until very recently, he does have a very good foundation for arm wrestling strength in certain areas. Brian has very good potential to have massive back pressure. He clearly has huge arms and very powerful elbow flexors. Although I was not able to find footage of Brian training with maximal weights on curls, he did talk about his heaviest set of curls in this clip here.
In the past, I have messed around with some pretty big weights for curls. I wouldn't call them strict, but I have used like 315 pounds for 4 sets. Of course, using a little bit of body English, of course, to get that up. And then, like 150-pound dumbbells, I've used those for curls before.
So if Brian is able to curl 315 pounds for reps, regardless of how much body English he is using, that is super impressive. And this would make you think he has very high potential for back pressure on the table. But of course, Brian would need to perfect his technique first in order to gain access to this back pressure. Similarly to what we've seen with Larry Wheels, just because you can curl a lot does not mean you have great back pressure on the table. You first have to gain access to this pressure via technique, and then you will have great back pressure on the table. Brian also has awesome potential for cupping. Although Brian again has not specifically trained cupping, he has trained a lot of grip strength over the course of his career. Things like Millennium dumbbells and blobs do not do a great job of mimicking the pressure one feels while cupping in a real match. But what this tells us is that Brian's forearms are insanely strong. So again, he probably does not have elite cupping right now, but he probably does have the potential to have elite cupping if he perfects his technique. Brian's wrist flexor strength is already elite, he just needs to learn how to translate that to the table. As far as pronation goes, I don't think Brian has really done very much training over the course of his career that would directly target pronation. But when lifting massive dumbbells or anything that is not totally stable, your pronation and supination will have to stabilize the weight, so these muscles will be worked. But if I had to guess, I would think that Brian's pronation will likely be his weakest link in the chain at the moment. As far as side pressure goes, I don't think that Brian has trained that specifically in any way either. But he probably has a pretty good amount of it once again just from stabilizing awkward weights via internal shoulder rotation. So in my mind, Brian probably has great baseline strength for back pressure and cupping that can be translated to the table without needing a huge amount of time to do so. However, he likely does not have the baseline strength in the areas of pronation and side pressure. I wouldn't want to put a limiter on what Brian is capable of, but at his height of around 6'9" tall, he is probably pretty locked in to an outside style. If Brian were to go into a hook with someone like Levan or Gennady Quigvinya, he would be giving up so much leverage since his arms are way longer. In order to beat someone with shorter arms in a hook, he would not only have to be stronger than them, but he would have to be way stronger than them in order to overcome his leverage disadvantage. As far as height goes, this would be similar to someone like Vitaly Laletin defeating Levan in a hook. It seems pretty difficult to imagine, but even if it is possible, it is certainly not the most efficient way. Along with Bryan's long arms comes more potential to generate height in a match and therefore more potential to crack wrists back. So in my opinion, a top roll is Bryan's most realistic option to go as far as he can in the sport. But this brings us back to his pronation. Bryan can likely develop his cupping and back pressure very quickly, but his pronation may take far longer to reach the point at which it is balanced with his back pressure and cupping. This means it could take Bryan several years to truly reach his potential, and Bryan is already 41 years old currently, so he will likely be wanting to downsize in the coming years. As we know, arm wrestling is a sport with a lot of longevity, and people often reach their peak into their late 40s or even 50s. So Bryan's age is not necessarily a problem, but it is also not ideal. So how long would it take for Bryan to reach an elite level from now? If we use Larry Wheels as a blueprint for strength athletes transitioning to arm wrestling, somewhere around 3 years sounds pretty realistic. But Bryan Shaw is a decent percentage stronger than Larry Wheels in most areas, and especially in the area of hand and wrist strength. So if we add the Bryan Shaw factor into the equation, maybe somewhere around 2 to 3 years is possible. But this all depends on how busy Bryan is, how committed he is to the sport, as well as many other factors. So if Bryan Shaw does fully commit to arm wrestling, would it be possible for him to eventually defeat Levan? Personally, I don't find it super likely. Although Bryan does have an insanely strong hand and wrist, I don't know that the strength he already has will be the most important strength for his best style. If Bryan was to defeat Levan, I think he would have to top roll him. As mentioned earlier, Bryan does have good potential for back pressure, but probably not the best potential for pronation. So for Bryan to crack Levan's wrist back, he would need to have more back pressure and pronation than Hermes Gasparini, more than Vitaly Laletin, more than Devin Larratt, etc. And keep in mind that these people have been training arm wrestling their entire lives. Bryan is just now getting into the sport at 41 years old. It is possible that Bryan's genetics are just so out of this world that he could reach a level of strength we've never seen before in the sport. However, I do find this unlikely. But let me know what you guys think about this, because this is all very unprecedented. In reality, I have no idea what Bryan is capable of, and maybe he can take over the sport. I am very excited to see Bryan progress in the sport. I definitely think he can reach a very high level at some point, and Bryan brings so much hype into the sport as well as some really cool potential matchups. I'd love to see Bryan pull Larry Wheels at some point, and maybe Bryan will bring other strongman competitors with him. A match between Bryan and someone like Eddie Hall or Thor Bjornsson would be super cool. I wish Bryan the best of luck in his arm wrestling journey, and I hope that he proves me wrong in regard to his potential. Who knows, maybe if Bryan does enough thumb curls, he just might be able to reach that #1 spot on the planet.